Hey guys, welcome back to the shop. So like we said in the last episode, in this one, we're going to put a front end back on our car. But just before I do that, there is one thing I want to take care of first. If you watched my transmission rebuild video when I was doing the 4L60, I used normal push to connect GM fittings on the transmission because I was thinking of putting hard lines the way GM did from the factory. However, when we put that in, right, space is kind of at a premium in the tunnel. So I decided I'm going to make one quick change. I'm going to swap over to AN hoses instead. So I should be able to make the turn a little bit sharper with the AN hose by using the appropriate fittings. And it'll make it easier to route around obstacles because we're in such tight quarters. It'll be a lot easier routing a hose around there than actually trying to bend hard lines to go around everything. So I'll do that first, just in case it's a little too tight. I might have to lean the transmission back down, so I don't want to have a whole bunch of stuff in the way and risk crashing into it when I move the driveline a little bit. So I'll do that first. But for those of you who have a keen eye, you might have noticed there's a belt on here now. You know, like they say, third time's a charm. So what I ended up finding that fits is a 6PK 2275, so 6 ribs, 2,275 millimeters. And for those of you who are not metrically inclined, that would be 89.5 inches, so 6K 895. And I will actually have a little update on our belt drive situation at the end of the video. So those of you that are interested, stay tuned till the end. So just to refresh everybody's memory or to bring any newcomers up to date, you can see how much room we had or didn't have, depending on how you want to look at it, between our transmission and our tunnel. And our cooler lines are coming up here and the return is way up here. Right, so there's not a whole lot of room up there. Would it be possible to still make hardline push connect? Yes, it would. Would it be very difficult to make them fit up there? Also, yes. So like I said, if we remove our two fittings in here and we replace them with 6AN to 1/4 inch NPSM, not NPT, NPSM. So what's the difference? NPT we're all used to working with, national pipe tapered, right? Pipe thread that is tapered as it goes. So the more you screw it down, the more it tapers, it wedges itself in the hole, and that's what creates the seal, right? 4L60s are not made for that thread. They are made for 1/4 inch national pipe. So it's the same size, same thread pitch, but straight cut. And the sealing comes mechanically, that's the M. The shoulder is cut square, so it's made to accept either an O-ring or a crush washer. That's what seals it to the surface. And actually, Aliexpress sells a nice little kit. I'll put a link in the description if you're interested. They give you quite a bit of 6AN hose that is oil resistant. That works for our cooler, and it comes with a variety of fittings as well. So part of the reason I said that I could make the bend easier with AN hose rather than hardline is because our elbows will make a slightly sharper corner, right? Yes, my push connect wouldn't be very much longer than that before I could make the nice bend down, but this is actually the big one. You can also get these type. So if I put these flush together on the end, you can see that the second type cuts down like maybe 5/16 of an inch closer. So by picking the right one, we'll be able to snake through there, and then we'll be able to make the 90 and just come down here and circle down around between the pan and the bell housing. And from that point on, we can keep going with hardline, route them along the engine oil pan, kind of like GM does with their engine oil cooler lines, and snake them out underneath the power steering pump to go reach where our cooler is in the front. So let's see how much of a pain in the butt it's going to be to get those fittings out of there, and then we can pick whichever elbow fits the best to route our hoses around, make a few hoses, and then we'll be able to keep going and put our front end back on. So let's get her done.
15 minutes later.
There. So I did manage to get everything done without having to take off the drive shaft and the exhaust and everything. I did have to support my transmission with the transmission jack, take the bolts out from my mount and lower it about an inch and a half, just so I could snake my hands in there. But I did get it done, and I will say, for those of you that are planning on doing this build or any other build where you're going to be putting a 4L60 somewhere where space is at a premium, do yourself a favor and cut these two tabs off of your transmission before putting it up there. Now, I can already hear it in the comments. Some people are going to say, like, those tabs must be there for a reason. And technically they are. You're not wrong, right? Those two tabs are the first hole that gets machined in the rough casting, and they actually locate it off of those two holes to do the first fly cut. And then once they have a straight square surface that is flat and square to the center line of the transmission, they reset off of that surface. And from that point on, those two ears have no purpose whatsoever. It's kind of like the transmission belly button, if you will. It had a very important function at some point in time, but now it's just a decoration. So if you want, you can definitely lobe them off, the ears, not your belly button. And that'll give you a little more room up here. Like, if I'd have had followed my own advice and I had a little more room here, I could have ran both of my lines through here. But because my tabs are still there, I had to route the return. That's the one that's higher up. I had to aim it backwards and go around the servo and come out back here. I did end up using the, let's say, the conventional elbows on both hoses. They fit better that way. And then the front one is coming up down here. So now I'll just make a couple more brackets off of these pan bolts to hold the hoses so they don't chafe on anything. And I'll run them parallel to the front of the pan up here. And like I said, I'll go with hard lines from that point on. That should take care of our cooler lines. And now I know for a fact that I will not have to move the drivetrain ever again. So we could put the front of the car back on. But while we're under here, we might as well address the last other thing down here, which is our shifter. I promise I'm not stalling. I'm just tying up loose ends. So let's go look at our shifter situation. Now, as far as the shifter goes, we are in luck because this generation of 6 Series still has a conventional shifter with a cable, right? The more recent generations of the 6 Series, the shifter in the car is just a switch that's an input to a computer. And there's actually an electric motor on the side that does the actual shifting of the transmission. But this one should be fairly easy to adapt. So what we're gonna have to do is establish on this shift cable how far is the travel. So I'm gonna have to go in the car, put it in park, measure how far this guy sticks out, put it in the furthest back position in the shifter, measure it again, figure out what my travel of my cable is. And then we're going to come up here and, wait a second, is this thing in park? Nope, now she's in neutral. There's park. So, going to have to measure again if this is park. And I can see all of my gears. So, reverse, neutral, drive with overdrive, drive without overdrive, low second, low first. So I'll have to figure based on the actual travel of my cable where that travel meets up to have the proper length for my shift lever. And speaking of shift lever, if you go like on Amazon or stuff like that and you write 4L60 shifter or shifter bracket, you can find a cute little universal kit. So the bracket is supposed to attach to the pan bolt. We may or may not use it, but you get the little shift lever. So again, we're going to have to put this on, figure out if any of these 3 holes are the right distance that give us the right length to have the right travel. If not, we might have to drill another hole in the right location, but it should be fairly simple to get that to work. And after that, we'll just have to make our own bracket to hold the shift cable in the right location to line up with our new shift lever. So let's figure that one out. Okay, so we're definitely not going to be able to use the factory hole in that aftermarket shift bracket. The cable on the BMW only moves in and out about 1 3/8, whereas if I measure that hole in that aftermarket shift lever, when I run the transmission through its entire gear range, I'm moving about 2.5 inches. So I'm going to have to go do some math to figure out how far away from the shaft we have to be to get that proper travel.
A lot of boring math later.
So since the original distance between the center of that hole and this one was exactly 2 inches, and that gave us a swing of 2.5 inches, that would mean that if we reduce that distance to 1 inch, we should get 1.25 inch swing, and we need 1 3/8. So a little bit of math, you come up with 1.1 inches, which would be right around 1 3/32. So that will put the hole right up here. If all that works out, we'll be able to simplify this lever quite a bit. But for now, I'll just leave it as is. I'll try it and see what happens. Speaking of which, down there, our shift cable isn't going to be quite long enough to reach this, right? So we're going to have to move the cable further down and aim it back up towards the lever. And then we're going to have to make some kind of an extension on the end of that cable to be able to reach our lever. But we'll cross that bridge when we get there. Let's start by modifying this thing.
5 minutes later.
Okay, so remember when I talked about my little bracket on Amazon? Forget I said anything. That ain't gonna work. So what I did here, I poked my new hole at the right location. I'll admit I'm a little bit too close. I could have been a little bit further. Right now in this position, I get 1.25 inch of travel instead of 1 3/8. But that's not my problem right now. The problem I'm having is that when I put this guy on, I don't know if you guys can see, the square opening for the lever up here is not straight with the lever. It's slightly clocked. And what's going on is that the way they have this opening positioned, so it registers with the flats on the shaft coming out of the transmission, when I put it in park, it is slightly angled this way. And when I go all the way to low first, I'm like fairly far off on the other end. What this is causing me a little bit of problem. Okay, if you guys are trying to figure out shift levers and all that stuff, the easiest way of doing it, let me change visuals. If you want the shifter to work properly, what you need to do is first find the central most position, right? On our 4L60, we have 7 shift position: park, reverse, neutral, overdrive, drive, low second, low first. So if you find the central position, which in this case would be overdrive, if, for example, that lever was straight up and down, you would want your shift cable to hit it exactly at a 90 degrees, so be fully horizontal. What this will do is that in that position, that's where your cable has the best angle possible to either push or pull the lever. And that means that when you go all the way to park or all the way to low first, you are moving the same amount of distance on both sides. So you're not as optimum as getting in and out of overdrive, but you're out by the same amount. That's what makes the best result. So in this case, if that was the case and overdrive was straight up and down, we'd have to mount our cables perfectly horizontal. Now, what I'm running into, like I said, if I line up that shaft as it is supplied, instead of having overdrive straight up and down, overdrive is like way over here, right? Part is only slightly over to the side, and then low first is way up here. Yes, that opening is clocked, so technically if I flip the lever around, I get a different result, but it's even worse. It's even further up that way, which doesn't work for us. The problem there, again, if I have my lever in that angle, overdrive would be slightly this way, which could still work if I was able to put my cable, again, at 90 degrees to the lever when the lever is in overdrive. However, to make my cable at that angle, that means that my bracket that holds the cable would have to be in between the transmission and the tunnel, and we know that space is already at premium. So what I'm going to have to do is make a new bracket, which means the Amazon bracket won't work anyways. And I'm going to have to make it lower down and then aim back up towards the shift lever to meet it at the right length. which means that, again, with the aftermarket lever, because it's at that angle, I'm no longer at a 90 degree, which would still work to put it in park. The problem that's going to happen is if I ever go into low first, if I'm at that angle, I'm not pushing forward anymore. I'm pushing towards the shaft. This thing would be almost impossible to take out of low first. It wouldn't want to shift forward. If my lever is at an upward angle, that means that overdrive has to be over here, right? Which means that I am going to have to make a new lever where the flats are clocked like more at this angle, not that angle, so that my lever in park is almost way up here, and then low first is down here instead, which means I'm going to have to make another lever. So forget what I said about the Amazon bracket. Looks like for this car, we're going to have to build everything from scratch. So I'll start with the levers. Now that I know pretty much what my distance needs to be, I can make a fairly simple lever. I'll just have to clock it in the right position. So let's start with that.
20 minutes later.
So here's the new lever, a lot simpler. I simply took a piece of 1/8 inch flat bar stock, 1 inch wide by 2 inch long. I went 1 inch wide because since my hole is clocked a little bit sharper angle, it wouldn't have left very much meat on each side if I had stayed with the 3/4 inch. And I poked my hole at the right location, and I cut the head off a little M6 bolt to have a little shouldered part where it is not threaded. And I will use that for my shifter. Let me bring you guys under the car and show you what the rest of the plan is. So with my new lever in position, I'm almost horizontal. I'm at a slight downward angle in park, which means reverse, neutral, overdrive. In overdrive, I'm slightly left of center. So if I run my cable somewhere like this at this angle, I'm 90 degrees to my little M6 shaft that I welded onto my lever, right? Which means that our bracket can hook up to these 2 bolts on the pan. It'll just be basically a piece of angle iron. I'll have to space it out a little bit because there's a lip on the pan, right? We're gonna have to go rest inside the pan rail. And then the bracket itself, I don't know if you guys will be able to see, I'll try putting a still image here, right? The cable, the way it was from the factory, there's a shoulder at this end, and then there was a rubber molded bracket that slipped over here, and then there was a very sophisticated circlip that grabbed it in that groove. So we're kind of gonna reproduce that part. I'm gonna have to measure very carefully the distance between this shoulder and the edge of the groove, which actually, I'll give you the measurement here. And then we'll have to make a block, probably cut a piece of bar stock out of something that's exactly that width. And then I'll have to drill a hole. It's a little hard to see probably from where you're at, but the diameter in the center is a little less, but it's a little more on each end. So I'm gonna have to drill a hole that diameter so that I can slide this in there. And then we can just grab a regular external circlip and lock it in place with the groove. And then that block will have a gusset welded around it, and the gusset will be welded to my piece of angle in a way that once I bolt it in place, it aims the cable directly at that shaft in the overdrive position. Now, as far as lengthening this guy, of course, this guy is a beautiful metric piece. It measures 5 mil in diameter. So what we're gonna do is, again, go shopping on Amazon. M6 coupling nut. I'll put a link in the description for you guys. M6x1 stainless steel threaded rod. What we're going to do, we're going to put an M6 nut on the end of the rod. Thread it so there's about 1/2 inch showing. Smear this guy full of red Loctite. Screw it in the coupling nut. Tighten our jam nut. Now, the minor diameter on an M6 bolt is just slightly smaller than 5 millimeters, so it actually slides on there nice and snug. So what we're going to do is, again, mark our position, and what I'm going to do is probably drill a hole about 3/8 of an inch from the end, and then 3/4 of an inch from the end. Thread those for set screws, turn the thing 1/2 a turn, and go 9/16 from the end and drill another hole there. So that means that we're going to have 2 set screws on one side and the other in the middle of it from the opposite direction. That should hold it good and tight. We're going to put it on with blue Loctite. This one you want to be able to remove it if you ever have to. So once we have that on there, that should hold it in place. And then we can just figure out how long we need that rod to be. Again, M6 rod end. So once we have the length we need, we can again thread a jam nut on there. Thread our rod end on there. Tighten our jam nut. This will fit perfectly on our little stud that we welded on our lever. We can put a nylock on the end of there, and that way our lever will be able to push and pull on our shifter. At least that's the plan. So let me take care of that off camera and I'll show you when I'm done.
A little longer than a few minutes later.
So here's the shifter in all its glory. Like I said, my bracket made from a thick wall piece of angle. I've welded 2 nuts to act as spacers to fit inside the pan rail. And my little bracket that actually holds the cable is just a piece of 1/2 inch thick by 1 inch wide piece of bar stock. I drilled a 15 millimeter hole through it to hold our cable. And of course, as luck would have it, our 1/2 inch bar stock ended up being not quite 1/2 inch. It was 490 thou for some reason. And we needed 525, right? And you want it to be tight. You don't want any play, because if you have any play, the cable will actually move in the bracket. It will actually hammer itself in the bracket, eventually make the cable fail. But as luck would have it, I didn't know exactly which side Circlip I was going to need to hold this guy on. So I bought a little kit like that. And I actually used an M15 one, which fit exactly over our cable. And the M15 Circlip in the kit was just around 35 thou thick. So that acted as the perfect shim. Put that on the cable first, ran it through the bracket. And then it turns out it's an M13 you need to log the cable in place. Did what I said with my little coupling nut and my little set screws. I actually marked on the BMW cable and actually ground a little recess where all the set screws line up, just to make sure it gives it a little extra hole. And I put them in with blue Loctite, as I said. Measured my length, trimmed everything down, and there she is. So now I just need to see if it works. Actually, I'm going to use you guys for that. I am going to bring the car down. I'm going to leave you guys underneath the car. I'll climb in and run the transmission through the gears, and you guys can holler and let me know if it actually shifts or not. Are you ready? Is it shifting? And now, as promised, we can start putting the front end of the car back on. So we'll start with our radiator assembly with the power steering cooler, the condenser, and the radiator, and the coolant fan. Now, I will make one quick modification for those of you with a keen eye. You'll notice that I've removed the engine oil cooler from the assembly, right? Like I said before, maybe you guys are new to the channel. I will not be running a turbo on this application because this is a base 6 series, not an M6. The M6 had a beefed up rear suspension and rear differential. This one, being the base model, has the smaller, weaker rear differential, which can only take about 475 horse. So my LS as is will probably be in the very high 300, low 400 kind of range. So I'm already like right about the safe spot. So I don't need an engine oil cooler. If you guys are planning on running boost though, an engine oil cooler is definitely a good thing, right? Part of how the turbo gets cooled is by the oil circulating through it, carrying the heat away. So you need an engine oil cooler to keep that happy. If any of you guys are doubting my resolve of using or not using an engine oil cooler, let's put it this way. Half of the Silverados that came to this world with engine weren't using an engine oil cooler. In fact, the base model work trucks didn't have an engine oil cooler, only the upper level ones did. So basically the trucks that worked the hardest didn't need an engine oil cooler, so neither will I. The one thing I will do though, and that might be overkill on my part, since I've removed my engine oil cooler, I've got the openings where the hoses will be. I will make block off plates to put in place, because part of making your cooling system as efficient as possible is to make sure that you force all the air that gets through the grill to go through the radiator. If there's any way around it because you don't have proper shrouding or anything like that, or if it can backfeed through openings in the shroud, any air that the fan can move without pulling through the radiator is air that will not contribute to the cooling. So I'm going to block off these openings just to make sure that I get as much air through the rad as possible. So let's get that done. So I've got the major part of our front end on, the ones that we need at least to figure out the rest of our hoses and all that. For now, I only have them on finger tight in case I have to take them back off when I'm fitting stuff. And I'm not gonna lie, by now it's been a couple of months since I took this thing apart, and I ended up struggling a bit to remember where everything went, but luckily BMWs are such a simple, straightforward design that it was pretty self-explanatory. Now the game plan hasn't changed, however, I might not be able to reuse my hoses the way I intended to, and I'll show you guys why. So starting on the driver's side, I talked about reclocking the factory hose so it would shoot straight up and go meet our LS water inlet, which is still the case, but the problem we're running into here is that the factory hose takes a little too long before she finally goes her 90 degrees upward. So I'm either gonna take the hose off and see if it fits on this end, because I could make it turn downward instead, or either way, I'm gonna have to find a sharper 90 hose to go down there, but we're still gonna bring that hose up here and reconnecting here, and that'll free up our little T for our transmission oil cooler at the other side. And on the driver's side, we pretty much run into the same issue. The game plan was take the top hose, make it curve over here and reconnect here, which it does, just a little too late, right? It puts the hose in line with our belt drive, which is kind of playing with fire. So again, I'm going to try to find a sharper 90 so we can have the hose coming in front of the belt drive and then reconnect at the water outlet. Another thing we're going to run into, I don't remember if I talked about it last time, that electric booster pump for the HVAC. It was originally located over here, but now it's a little too close to where my alternator wants to be. So what I'm going to do is remove the pump, clock the bracket 180 degrees, put it on this side instead, on this little pocket that's found here in the corner where the windshield washer fluid goes. And then I'm going to have to reconnect the hose. Now, of course, it fits a little tight. Here, I'm not sure what I'm going to do. This quick connect is again the same size as what we used on our overflow tank, that 45 that we use. I have the 90, which I could use if I can't find another 45, then simply have another 90 made out of rubber. But that should work for the pump. Of course, then we're gonna have to lengthen the other hose that connects on top here as well. But there should be room to sneak it by our air cleaner box. We might have to modify the bottom of the air cleaner box just to give it a little more clearance if that's the case. But that shouldn't be too bad. And we should still be able to use the air cleaning box for the application. And since I briefly mentioned the transmission oil cooler before, my hard line that I made is coming up where it can connect to the larger hose on the cooler. Okay, I'll admit I made it a little long. I'll be able to cut off maybe an inch off of it, make it easier to make the transition from my hard line to the cooler. And then the original hose for the return will go back there. Again, it wants to be a little too close to our belt drive, but doesn't really matter because I'll just cut it right here and then make a hard line, like I said before, that'll go right behind my fan and come back on this side and reconnect to the T over there. So we will be able to get all of our hoses done. And as far as the AC hoses are concerned, you can simply reattach the two factory BMW hoses to the condenser on this corner. And then you can go on Amazon and buy this kit over here. I'll leave a link in the description. And these two little adapters will bolt directly to your GM AC compressor. And it will transform these two ports to standard size number 8 and number 10 female O-ring fittings for AC hoses. And then you can go on a place like Retrofit USA and buy a number 8 female O-ring fitting to number 8 hose, 45-degree fitting like this one, to attach to our number 8 hose. So the BMW hose that has the high port service side over here should be, hopefully, long enough to meet that fitting. If not, you might have to straighten out the hardline part where the service port actually is in order to reach that fitting. And then you're also going to need a number 10 female O-ring fitting to number 12 hose, because the large AC hose from the BMW is actually number 12, and then that hose will never reach the fitting. You'll have to cut it behind the power steering reservoir, and you'll have to lengthen it a little bit. So you'll also need a number 12 to number 12 hose splice and a little bit of number 12 AC hose. So that should be good to button up our AC system completely. One more thing we're going to have to address in the plumbing department is going to be this guy. Now, this used to be bolted to the front of both cylinder heads. It avoided the water pump, and then it went and backfeed our power steering pump. But honestly, like, I could run another hard line parallel to the one I already made for the coolant for our transmission oil cooler. But there's a whole lot of stuff in that real estate already. And back here, I've got a whole bunch of room between my cross member where my steering rack is and where the oil pan sump actually gets deeper. There's like 4 inches here of space. And if I stand right here, I can see the back of my power steering pump where I need to hook up my hose. And I can see the bottom of the power steering reservoir and the hose I have to intersect with. So I'm even thinking I could reuse this hose. If I grind down this clamp again and I flip it the other way around so that I get this nice 90-degree hooked up to the back of my pump going downward. I can cut this hose here, flip it 180-degree, and have it go underneath my oil pan. And then I'll just have to make another 90-degree to go up and meet over there. Easy peasy. Because I've got at least 2.5 inches behind the back of my AC compressor and my engine mount, and same thing on that side. I've got like 3 inches easy behind the back of the power steering pump and the engine mount on that side. So I've got lots of room down here. So I think I'm going to route it down here instead. And at the same time, the power steering reservoir over there is way higher on the fender than the pump is. So it'll feed constantly. That won't be an issue. I think I'll make it easier. The other hose from the power steering reservoir routes in the stock location, and it just reconnects to the power steering cooler. We don't have to modify anything there. So let me just do that off camera, and that'll be one more hose down. And while I'm here, I might as well finish our transmission cooler hoses. So again, I'm going to save the BMW hose part. So we have our quick connects. I can reconnect them into place, and then I'll make them curve to follow along the engine oil pan rail, like I said. And then we can go just around the oil filter and come meet our AN hoses that we did previously. So again, that should be fairly straightforward. And as far as my update for our accessory belt drive bracket, here's the thing. When I had mine cut by Send Cut Send, one of the great things about Send Cut Send is that you can have your quote made for 1 part, 2 part, 10 part, bunch of part, right? So the more you make, the cheaper it gets. So I'd actually priced out how much it would be to make 10 of them. I was planning to get 10 brackets cut, buy the stuff to make the spacers, cut the spacers, buy the hardware, have a nice little package ready to send to you guys for those of you that were interested. And then, of course, the whole thing with the tariffs happened. So now we got tariffs on aluminum products on both sides of the border, which means that if I was ordering 10 brackets, I would pay the Canadian counter tariff when Send Cut Send sends them to me. And then if somebody from the US wanted a bracket kit, they would have to pay the tariff when it goes back across the border, et cetera, et cetera. And that was starting to make the whole thing a little too costly. So I was thinking maybe it won't happen. And then one of my viewers in the comment, so a special shout out to Tinin Family Farm, hopefully I pronounced that right, asked me if I would consider selling the files because he said he knew somebody that had access to a CNC machine. And I'm going to admit I hadn't thought of that, but that is a brilliant idea. That way, doesn't matter where you live, you can just get the files, have them cut by somebody locally using aluminum from your own side of the border. Nobody has to pay tariffs. Works great, right? And I don't know about you guys, but me personally, I feel like the government's already getting a big enough share of my paycheck. I don't feel like giving them any more. So what I did, of course, being the cheapskate that I am, I went on Shopify, found the cheapest option to make an online storefront that I can sell digital products. And then I made a file, like a zip file, that contains the 2 files that you guys need to have the brackets cut, the inner and the outer brackets. And I added another Word document that's just like an instruction sheet that tells you what kind of product you need to make the spacers and what length and what hardware you need. That way, you guys can have your brackets made locally, save yourself the extra taxes, and everybody can have brackets. So now, our driveline is done. Our exhaust is done. Most of my plumbing is done. Yes, I'm waiting for my AC fittings and that one quick connect 45-degree for our little booster pump over there. But other than that, everything else should be plumbed. So I will be able to put the rest of the front end on, the grill and the headlights and all that stuff. And it seems like the only thing we're going to have left is going to be wiring and electrical. But that won't be in this video. That'll be in the next episode. So I'll let you guys go for now, and I'll see you next time in the garage.